Hi, everyone. So it looks like we're back to doing this again. Yay, COVID. So you've heard, hopefully from the college, from the Polytechnic, that we're moving back online, at least for a little bit. So I expect some news coming out later today or tomorrow, definitely by Monday, talking about what's going to happen with courses next week. I'll post a message on Blackboard as soon as I know what we are planning to do. But I mean, there's at least a reasonable possibility that we're going to be required to go online for, a week, 2 weeks, the rest of the semester. Who knows? Hopefully it's not very long. But yeah, I'll post a message up on Blackboard, so keep your eyes posted on that. I wanted to post a video lecture just covering the rest of this week's material so that we know what's going on. So here's a video on problems with behaviorism. Last class, right, we went through the behaviorist model. We talked about motivations for it. Behaviorists basically try to reduce out the mind, right? They say, if you're a methodological behaviorist, you say, there's there's the black box inside our head. I don't know what that is. I can't really say anything about it, at least not scientifically. And if we're going to sort of study the mind in an empirical, scientific way, we just can't talk about these things like introspective mental states or consciousness or subjectivity. They're not the kind of things that can be observed and replicated and studied in any empirically sound way. So just as a methodology, we're going to get rid of them, right? And that's what our methodological behaviorists did. And there's some problems with that, which we're going to talk about, but that was the approach. We also talked about a group of people called philosophical or ontological behaviorists, and they came out of the logical positivist movement, which we talked about last class, and there's material on them in your notes. But they had very specific views about language, right? They thought anything that wasn't an analytical truth or wasn't a synthetic truth is nonsensical. Analytical truths are sentences that are true just by definition, like 2 + 2 = 4, or all bachelors are unmarried, right? If you know what those words mean, you just know that a bachelor is unmarried, or you just know 2 + 2 = 4, right? Given what those words mean, we know that that is true. That's what an analytical truth is. The synthetic truths are these claims that are only true if the world turns out to be a certain way. So they're very rigorous, very careful sentences that make a specific observational claim about the world. Water is H2O, for example, right? Makes a claim that this liquid that we observe, that we call water, has a very specific chemical composition, right? It's 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. That sentence is true if it's consistent with the observations that we are able to acquire about the world. It's false in all other cases. So our logical positivists said those are the only 2 sources of knowledge, analytical truths and synthetic truths. Now, what we do when we're doing science is we get the set of synthetic truths that are relevant to the thing we're talking about, and then we go out and get observations to find out if those things are true. Now, when we talk about the mind, right, the logical positivists and our ontological behaviorists, or our logical behaviorists, they said most of what we've said in human history about the mind is nonsensical. It's not verifiable in any interesting way, and it's not an analytic truth. So the vast majority of claims humanity has made about the mind are just gobbledygook. We're so deeply confused about what we're talking about that we can't even start, right? It's not that those claims are false. They're not even the kind of thing that can be false. And so if we're going to study the mind, said the logical behaviorist, we've got 2 jobs. Take these sentences that we think mean something about the mind, such as, I am in pain right now, or Steve hurt his arm, and try to translate that into a sentence that is either analytic or synthetic. And then once you get it as a synthetic truth or an analytic truth, then you go figure out if it's true, right? Analytic truth will just be true by definition, so it's not all that interesting. The synthetic truths are the ones that are interesting. They're the ones that the brain scientists should work on. But there'll be very specific claims about observations. And that's really all there is, says the philosophical behaviorist or the ontological or the logical behaviorist. All those terms are interchangeable. That's all there is to studying the mind. And that was their view. And for a time, it was very successful, and it was sort of like the main game in town. Lots of problems with all these views. So let's talk about them. The first set of problems, and there's a whole bunch of this kind of a problem, right, is people realize very quickly that there's all sorts of translation problems. There's all sorts of things we want to say about mind that just can't be translated in any interesting sense into analytic truths or synthetic truths. And so that's the first set of problems we're going to look at, right? Like, let's look at a really simple sentence. Paul has a toothache, right? This is a claim that involves something to do with his mind, right? Because a toothache's a kind of pain. So there's some sort of, there's something going on here, right? That involves the mind. So this is the kind of thing that our logical positivists, our behaviorists in general, would want to have something to say about. So what is it? Well, Paul has a toothache is going to mean something like a list of stuff, right? And the list should include the following kinds of things. When Paul has a toothache, when we say Paul has a toothache, we mean that Paul's going to weep. He's going to make gestures probably towards his mouth and maybe hold his jaw, right? Like he's going to look like he's in pain, right? But we can't use the word pain. So what's he going to do? He's going to hold his tooth. He's going to cry. You know, he's going to wince. If we asked him what's the matter, he would be disposed to say, I have a toothache, right? So that behavior is going to be connected with this phrase, Paul has a toothache. On close examination of his mouth, we're going to see that there's a decayed tooth with an exposed pulp or whatever kind of physical thing that causes the tooth damage, the tooth pain. Again, I'm using the word pain. I can't use the word pain. Maybe if we look at Paul's physiology, we're going to see that his blood pressure, his digestive processes, the speed of his reactions are going to have various kind of properties. There's going to be a bunch of processes occurring in his nervous system. And, you know, roughly that, right? These are all the observable features of a toothache, right? And we would just have to make a list of this. And we'd say, these are all the things that we mean when we say Paul has a toothache. Now, first question we should ask is, well, does this capture what we mean when we say Paul has a toothache? Our critics of behaviorism are going to say no. First of all, a lot of these claims seem like they're unnecessary parts of a toothache, right? So we might say C and E don't seem like they're necessary. You could have a toothache without having a decaying tooth. You could have a toothache without having changes to your blood pressure, your reaction time, your digestive processes. You can have a toothache without having changes to your central nervous system, right? So those can't be part of our definition, right? It seems like they're often correlated with a toothache, but they're not necessary parts of a toothache. So they can't be definitional terms in what is a toothache. Right? Our second claim is a verbal behavior, right? Paul, if we ask Paul what's wrong, Paul will go, I have a toothache. Well, that's verbal behavior. That's not observable, right? It involves language. So that can't really be a part of a good behaviorist definition either, especially if you're the philosophical behaviorist, right? It's something you're going to have to reduce out in some way. So you haven't simplified things enough or reduced them enough. So that can't be key. For example, like if we think about verbal behavior, right? What's going on when somebody verbally behaves? You know, well, you're using language, and when we use language, we're meaning something. So you've got this concept of meaning. What is a meaning? What is meaning on a behaviorist account? It's got to be reduced down to some sort of behavioral thing. So meaning is, again, one of those words, right? Our logical positivists would say, hey, look, I think you feel like you mean, can't use language. I think you feel like there's something to that phrase. Like when you go, Paul means something by his sentence, you know, there's something you're trying to convey to me, but you don't know what you mean by mean because you can't reduce mean down to a observation. And it's not an analytic truth. So I don't know what you mean by mean. So when you're talking about verbal behavior like language and you've got this concept of meaning in there, that's not legitimate. So go back and work on your sentence and reduce it more, and then we'll start looking at what you're talking about. Right? We see a problem there already. How are you going to talk about language without talking about things like semantics and syntax and meaning? Paul, when he uses a sentence, it looks like he intends to express something, right? He's trying to express that he's in pain. Well, this intention and this, right, like that's not there yet either, right? The behavior doesn't have the tools to do that. We're thinking Paul probably intends to tell us something true. He's not lying to us. Lying's going to pose a whole host of other problems, right? So not only does he intend, but he also intends to convey factual information about the world. Well, again, on a behaviorist account, what on earth could those be? Another one here, Paul assumes that the person he is speaking with is capable of understanding and translating, right? So he's also, by speaking to me, assuming a bunch of things about me that are, again, not observable, what my mind's like. So that's not the type of thing, right? Anything involving language or communication of information or intentional, like that's not the type of stuff that the behaviorist allows for in their translations. So this is too grossly overcomplicated to be the kind of thing a behaviorist would be satisfied with. So it can't be part of the definition of Paul has a toothache. So the only thing we're left with is A, Paul weeps and makes a bunch of gestures. So what is a toothache? Paul weeping and just gesturing towards his mouth. But then immediately, right, you're going to say, well, that's not what a toothache is, right? And those are probably not even necessary parts of a toothache, right? Surely you can have a toothache and not cry, or you can have a toothache and not even gesture towards your mouth. So huge problems, right? Even something simple like Paul has a toothache just doesn't look like it can be translated in any coherent sense into a synthetic truth that can be verified by observation, because it's importing way too much mental content, right? And all that mental content would have to be eliminated before we get to the kind of thing that's a synthetic truth. Right, so the task that the behaviorist had available to them, trying to take mental language, mental sentences, and reduce them down to, observation statements, synthetic truths, was looked insurmountable, right? And people spent decades, right? Like really smart people spent decades trying to do this, trying to reduce these kind of sentences down to the kind of things where you could go, oh, well, this observation will verify the truth of this sentence. And arguably they didn't get anywhere. As with every theory we're going to look at in this class, there's still behaviorists around today, right? There's still philosophical behaviorists. There's definitely methodological behaviorists. So even though I say, the vast majority of people have, moved on from this view, you're going to find, you will find people that go, no, we just have to be more rigorous. We just have to be more careful and we'll be able to do this work. It's hard, but yeah, the mind's hard to understand. So, but there's a problem, right? Translating any sentence about the mind into an analytic or a synthetic truth is incredibly difficult, perhaps even impossible. But it's a necessary part of this project if you're going to do it. The text I gave you raises this challenge to behaviorists from Sellars. Sellars is a fairly influential philosopher of the mind. So he raises more translation issues, right? So Stacy believes there are no native leopards in North America, right? That's the sentence we're going to try to translate. That is even harder to translate than a claim about pain behavior, right? Because at least with pain behavior, there's something you can observe, right? And there's a physiological thing, right? Like if I'm in pain, we know there's something causing the pain, right? Unless it's a phantom pain, I guess. But, there's something we can kind of look at. We go, okay, well, we're with a pain statement, we're trying to get some sort of account of me communicating information about what's happening to my body, right? What's going on when I say Stacy believes there's no native leopards in North America? There's, if we weren't behaviorists, we'd say there's some sort of mental state, right? There's a propositional attitude, there's a belief that she somehow possesses, and it's about native leopards in North America. How do we reduce that down to either an analytic truth or a synthetic truth? What's going on here, right, is that we're looking at a higher cognitive state, right? We're not just merely looking at sort of like a physiological response to the world and the associated communication of that. We're looking at something like a belief. Apply the same to plans, projects, intentions, right? Attitudes, values. So what's our behaviors do? And one, probably the best thing they came up with is say, well, when we say that Stacy believes there's no leopards in North America, what we mean by that is something like, well, Stacy's believes that, and then I have P equals definition. That just means Stacy possesses in some way a propositional attitude. And we're going to define that propositional attitude as, if we asked Stacy, is it true that there's no native leopards in North America? Stacy would say, yes, it is true that there are no native leopards in America. So what we're saying is that her belief reduces down to a disposition to act or a disposition to behave in certain ways under certain circumstances. Last class, I talked about dispositions a bit. Dispositions are just properties things have that might never actually be manifest in the world, but under certain circumstances, the object will behave in certain ways. Classic example of this is a fragile glass has a disposition to shatter under certain circumstances. And that's what we mean by fragile, right? Is just the properties of the glass are such that if you drop it or you hit it in the right way, it'll shatter. So when we say Stacy believes that there's no native leopards in North America, what we're saying is, well, the object Stacy has the following kind of property. If we asked her, do you believe that there are no native leopards in North America? She would say, yes, I do believe that. And that's the behaviorist reduction of belief. That's not satisfying, right? And I probably don't have to say anything else for you to say, well, that's not really what a belief is. Problem one, language again, right? We're importing understanding and intention. And as behaviorists, we're not allowed to do that, right? Because we haven't reduced understanding and intention to observational states yet. So this isn't an adequate definition. You have to go further. Second, too, why think that believing that there's no native leopards in North America is going to make it so that anytime somebody asks you, do you believe this? You're going to say, yes, I do. Maybe you're going to lie about it, right? Lying poses a huge problem when it comes to trying to reduce beliefs down to a disposition to say certain things or respond in certain ways. Because we all know that just because we believe things doesn't mean that we're going to communicate those beliefs to others. Right? We might directly lie and say, hey, no, I don't believe this, that it's false. There are native leopards in North America. Or we might just say nothing, right? You might press somebody and go, do you believe this? And they might just do nothing. But we need to include that in our account if our model is going to accurately account for what a belief is. And Sellar says, yeah, the behaviorist doesn't have that. So then he gives us this kind of formal argument. Our concept of a mental state includes that mental states cause or explain certain kinds of behaviors, right? My belief that there are no native leopards in North America should cause me to say, yes, I believe that when pressed, right? How does that belief do that work? Well, that belief looks like it does that work because it impacts other mental states that I have. Right? My intentions towards my beliefs will impact how I convey them to you, right? If I have an intent to tell you the truth, and then you ask me, do you believe that there's leopards in North America? My intention, that mental state, and my other mental state, my belief that there are leopards in North America will interact in some way, and they will cause me to go, yes, I do believe this. But if I have an intention to deceive you, which is a different kind of mental state, and I have, again, the belief that there's no leopards in North America, well, then those will interact and I will behave in different ways, right? So it looks like our concept of mental states includes that mental states cause and explain sort of behaviors, and mental states cause each other to do certain types of things, right? Now, if I'm a behaviorist, what I must do is I must reduce all of that stuff down to physiological stuff, right? And observable stuff. So I'm going to have to reduce down my intentions. I'm going to reduce my beliefs to physically observable things, right? Why do I need to do that? Well, because the only evidence we have available to us is the observational stuff, right? The empirically observable. Our causal explanations of the world cannot be circular, right? If I'm trying to explain to you what caused, I don't know, what caused the glass to shatter, I can't say, well, the glass shattered because, well, I can't just repeat myself. I can't say glasses shatter because glasses are the types of things that shatter, right? That would be a circular explanation, right? Like that doesn't give you anything that wasn't already there. I'm just repeating what you said to me, right? But it looks like any behaviorist explanation is going to be circular. Any behaviorist causal account of how the world works is going to have to just repeat back the behavior and a disposition to behave in that certain way. But that doesn't tell us anything interesting. That doesn't bring in, well, what actually caused me to do what I do, right? So like if I say, look, my belief that there's a leopard in North America reduces down to me expressing, I believe that there's leopards in North America. You go, okay, well, so that's what a belief is. Now, what caused you to tell me the truth? And you go, well, I have a belief that there's leopards in North America. What is that belief? It's just me saying there are leopards in North America. Like that's as circular as it gets, right? So there's the problem, right? Maybe I'll go through that one more time. The example Sellars use is turnips taste best when harvested in August. Turnips never taste good. When I say that, I'm trying to signify something. I'm giving you a thought that I have, and that thought will somehow causally influence my behavior. Have a thought, turnips taste best when harvested in August, and saying turnips taste best when harvested in August is supposed to convey that thought. Take a trained parrot that can make human noises, right? When it says turnips taste best when harvested in August, it's not conveying a thought, right? It's just parroting back to me what it heard, right? It's not it making those sounds is not a cause of behavior. Whereas me claiming turnips taste best when harvested in August, that is a behavior, right? So what makes them different? Well, for the behaviorist, what is the phrase turnips taste best? What is the belief that turnips taste best when harvested in August? Well, it's a tendency to say turnips taste best when harvested in August, right? Or a disposition to express that. But when the parrot has the same disposition, right? What makes them different from each other? There doesn't look like there's any grounds for making the distinction, right? But how would you distinguish that? You're going to appeal to some sort of mental state, intentions, values, feelings, preferences. That's what makes my statement, turnips taste best when harvested in August, different from the parrot's expression. So without those things, intentions, goals, or plans, the account is hopelessly incomplete, right? Sellar says, look, you can make the same kind of claim just by talking about reflexes, right? What's the difference between an intentional kick and a reflexive kick? Well, for the behaviorist, it doesn't look like there is any, because they're both just the same manifest behavior. Without the intention in the picture, there's nothing here. And there is no space in the behaviorist model for the intention. So we just reduce down to the kick, and then the kick is all we have to appeal to. Well, that's at best circular, right? So language problems. Behaviorist accounts look like they have to smuggle in mental language. They're not allowed to do that. The kind of translations they look like they're required to do look virtually impossible. The complexity of definitely human behavior, but probably any animal behavior looks like it would grossly overcomplicate any kind of behaviorist model, right? Like getting things like intentions and lines and truth tellings and plans and projects and values, all that kind of stuff into any sort of behaviorist account looks like it would be virtually impossible. And if not impossible, your statements, your behavior statements would be just so grossly overcomplicated as to be like, you know, useless jargon. And then this kind of further related issue, the behaviorist account doesn't look like it can distinguish between mental or overt behaviors that are caused by other mental states and non-behaviors, like me saying something to convey meaning to you versus the parrot just uttering what it heard, or me reflexively kicking versus me intentionally kicking. None of that complexity looks available to the behaviorist. And we know, if we know anything about our minds, that that kind of stuff must be accounted for. And that just doesn't look like it's there. So the attempt to translate the mind into behaviors looks like it's deeply, deeply problematic. Third problem. Does pain entail pain behavior? We can generalize this. Do mental states entail explicit behaviors associated with those mental states? The behavior is committed to our behaviorist is committed to the following. It's an analytic conceptual truth that anybody in pain has a propensity to wince or groan, right? We talked about our toothache case, and it looked like the only thing that behaviorists had available to them that wasn't problematic was toothaches equal a tendency to be in pain, like to express pain behaviors. So it's going to be a conceptual truth that anybody in pain has a propensity to behave in certain ways, right? They're going to wince, they're going to groan, they're going to scream or whatever. Now, is that true? It's probably not true, first of all, just with humans, right? Like just because a human has a pain doesn't mean that they're going to have an overt pain behavior, at least on the surface. But suppose we give that to our behaviorist. Well, what about non-human animals? I've got a picture of an octopus up because octopuses are as alien from humans as you get, given the kind of creatures that we know are on this exist. They have a radically different evolutionary past than us, right? Like, like you look at mammals and stuff like that, they're at least, sort of closely connected to us in, on an evolutionary scale, but octopuses, I mean, that's getting really alien, but yet they have these elaborate mental lives as far as we can tell. But so what about non-human animal pain? Can they experience pain, right? The cat or the dog or the bear, right? If they're in pain, they will probably behave very similar to how a human might behave. But our octopus is not likely to do that. The octopus is not going to wince or groan. Can they be in pain? General problem here, whatever behavior type is picked, we can coherently imagine a pain-capable organism that is physically unsuited to produce the behavior that we've talked about. Now, if that's true, if it's true that non-human animals, even ones that are quite different from us, can have mental states that are similar to ours, even if they can't physically behave in the same way as us, then there isn't going to be a specific behavior type that's entailed by a given mental state. And then behaviorism, the behaviorist attempt to account for pain or happiness or sorrow is going to fail, right? That definition is going to be inadequate because it picked out a behavior that's species specific when it needs to be sort of going, no, here's the behavior that is universally associated with pain. Now, all these translation objections that I've pointed to, right? These really influential stuff. A lot of this comes from a guy by the name of Noam Chomsky, who we talked about last class. One of his claims to fame, one of the things that made his career for him was the time he spent attacking the behaviorist approach and saying there's got to be a better way to think about what we're talking about when we talk about minds. Our text also raises the Geach Chisholm objection. Again, these are two further philosophers. They want to argue that mental states can't be individually connected with behaviors. For any given mental state, it is only going to connect with an overt behavior via its connection with other mental states and its interaction with a contextual environment. So the example they give is, suppose Jane fears tigers and is on a jungle expedition and there's a tiger 5 feet away from her, right? So Jane's got this really strong fear of a tiger, and now she's in a jungle and there's a tiger 5 feet away from her. Our behaviorist account of fear is our fear of tigers, right, is going to be some sort of overt behavior about tigers and the way like she'll be paralyzed, right, or her jaw will drop, or she'll scream, or she'll run, right, like something like that. That's going to be what our account of fear is. But I mean, the problem is even if there's a tiger 5 feet away from her, she might not manifest any of those behaviors, right? It's going to depend upon the contextual environment that she's a part of. It's going to depend upon whether or not she can see the tiger. Can she observe the tiger? So her fear is dependent upon her having another mental state, right? The observational state, the sensation of a tiger, right? So whether or not any mental state is connected with a behavior is going to depend upon its connection with other mental states, right? Her fear for a manifestation depends on whether or not she believes there's a tiger nearby. And then it's going to depend on a bunch of other stuff about her, right? Without these additional mental states, there will be no behavior. Now, what's the problem for our behaviors? Think about that. I want to translate Jane's fear of tigers into a synthetic truth, into a statement about behaviors, right? Well, I can't just translate fear statements into synthetic truths. I have to go specifically to Jane, and then I have to go, Jane's fear translates into a synthetic truth into a set of behaviors when it interacts with Jane's belief and Jane's perception and Jane's, I don't know, attitudes about how she manifests her fear. So I've probably got like 10 or 20 different mental states at a minimum, right? That all interact to produce whatever her fear behavior is in this specific context. And my synthetic truth, the proper behaviorist sentence, is going to have to reduce all of that down to like one, here's the observational sentence we can test. And then we change the environment slightly, right? So Jane's fear of spiders, how is that different from her fear of tigers? Maybe that's another 32 different mental states. So we're gonna have a list of like every single manifest behavior of fear that Jane's gonna have, right? And that's just Jane. Now, if we want to sort of get to people, our list is going to be, for just fear, is going to be this, you know, is going to be exponentially complicated, right? And that's not looking like an interesting or workable model of the mind, right? That's the claim here. So tons and tons of translation problems, right? Just in practice, it doesn't look like the kind of things we say about minds lend themselves to remotely practical translations into the kinds of sentences behaviorists wanted or needed, which gives you a reason for pause and to think maybe this theory is untenable. A second kind of problem is when we talk about an action, right? And I mean, this is built into our issues about translation, but actions in particular are really complicated mental things, right? Our philosophical behaviorists, when they start talking about actions, finds that they have very, very little to say, right? like maybe they get a disposition to express pain or fear. You know, if they're really, really careful and lucky, maybe they can do something with those. But when we start talking about actions, right, these look like they're vastly more complicated than anything the behaviorist has available to them. The behaviorist approach looks just way too theoretically simple to tell you anything interesting about actions. How do desires work to influence behaviors? How do beliefs work? How do intentions work? How do plans, projects, all these things, like when you have an action, right? There's multiple mental states that are interacting with each other in really complicated ways. And our behaviors has nothing to say about that because they just got to reduce all of that down to overt behaviors, right? So the model looks hopelessly flawed when you start trying to apply it to action or any of the action related concepts like intention and choice, desire. People worked on this, right? People worked very, very carefully on trying to give accounts of what an action is. And a lot of this work influenced cognitive science, computer science, formal logics, right? And our moves away from behaviorism, we're going to see have a lot to do with people building models of like mental cognition, of information processing, of the production of actions. And a lot of this work has had really profound influences on fields like artificial intelligence research, or on discussions about responsibility, or on the issues of what language is. But we'll get into those over the next couple of weeks. So action is not only untranslatable, but it's also basically unknowable and incomprehensible to our behaviorists. So that seems like a problem. Behaviorists run into the consciousness problem. Now, I mean, consciousness is one of those things where you go, yeah, but everybody's got a problem with consciousness, right? Like nobody has anything interesting to say about consciousness. So not surprisingly, behaviorists have virtually nothing to say about consciousness. Definitely have nothing to say about qualia, right? Qualia is this phrase we're going to hear over and over again in this class. Qualia is the properties that subjective experience have, right? Like there's something it's like for you to be you, there's something it's like for you to see my green sweater, right? Whatever that subjective experience is, the properties of that experience are what we call the qualia, right? And supposedly, if we're going to give an account of consciousness, one of the things we have to account for is that what it is likeness, the qualia of experience. And our behaviorist has nothing to say about that, right? In fact, you know, behaviorists came out of like a model where they said basically whatever is in your mind is just a big black box, right? It's just whatever your qualia is, it's a beetle. And we have nothing intelligible to say about it, right? So behaviorism has a consciousness problem, but then so does everybody else. We have a further problem. Behaviorists have a real difficult time with other minds, right? We seem to have a deeper knowledge of our own mental life than we do of other people. For the behaviorists, that doesn't look like it should be the case, because what are minds? Minds are just behaviors. They're just dispositions to behave in certain contexts. So that's external to us, right? That's something that should be readily available to everybody. But yet that seems false, right? It seems like my mind is known better to me than probably anything else is to me, right? My mind is known better to me than it is to you, and your minds are known better to you than they are to me, right? Behaviorist has to reject that. And then on top of that, the behaviorist doesn't seem like they have anything that's sort of going to give us knowledge. So we don't have knowledge of our own selves, but we also don't have anything that's sort of getting at what's in the beetle in the box in other people's heads, right? So that seems inadequate. So behaviorism, deeply flawed theory of the mind. But I mean, so are all the other theories. Why do we talk about it? Why does this matter? as I've said, the vast majority of academics have moved beyond behaviorist approaches, both in the brain sciences and in philosophy and cognitive science, right? We all seem to agree, or most of us seem to agree, that there is more to our mental language, the sentences we say about our mind, than merely behavior. And most of us agree that the mind isn't something that should be reduced out of the world. The mind is a real thing. What that is a really complicated question, especially if you're not a dualist, right? Like the dualist wants to say the mind is this special kind of non-physical stuff. It exists, non-physical stuff. Behaviorists want to say mind's, I don't know what you're talking about with the mind. Mind just reduces to behavior. Vast majority of people say, no, that was a mistake. That's too strong of a claim. The mind is something. It's just not a non-physical thing. Let's look for it elsewhere, right? That said, behaviorism was an incredibly useful way of getting us to sort of rethink the way that we approach the mind, right? Like before behaviorism, we were really stuck with dualist approaches. Despite their best efforts, the early psychologists were they were locked into an introspective model that, at least implicitly assumed dualism, that the mind couldn't be a physical thing. And that made it, opaque and inaccessible to even our most careful sciences. The behaviorists gave us a path away from that, right? They said, they gave us a way to sort of go, no. Here we go. Here's a way to sort of be careful about this. And that was incredibly valuable work and has had profound impact on where we are today and how much we think we know about our minds. Right, so it helped us get past dualism. Unless, of course, you're still a dualist, in which case, this is just a bunch of crazy people that distracted us. Behaviorism also gave us a really useful method for looking at the world when verbal communication is impossible or difficult, right? We know so much about non-human animals that we really wouldn't have access to if we hadn't adopted behaviorist methodologies, right? That's as straightforward as it gets. So that's behaviorism. Next week, we're moving on to the identity approach to mind. Sums up in the phrase, the mind is the brain, right? So we're going to spend some time looking at neuroanatomy. I think if you're going to talk about claims like the mind is identical to the brain, whether you're going to reject them or accept them, you sort of need to know something about what the brain is, right? So we're going to spend some time talking about that. And then we're going to look at the views that kind of come off of that. But yeah, that's the next approach that we're going to look at. People that think minds are identical to brains. Have a good one.